It was a quiet evening in a small town, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and life moved at a slower pace. The streets were mostly empty, with only a few cars passing by. The sun had just set, and the sky was painted in shades of orange and purple. In the middle of this peaceful scene, a man was walking down the sidewalk. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 30s, wearing a simple jacket and jeans. His face was calm, but there was a quiet strength in his eyes. He had served in the military for over a decade, and even though he was now a civilian, he carried himself with the discipline and respect that he had learned during his time in the service. As he walked, he noticed a police car slowly driving down the street. The car slowed down as it approached him, and the man didn't think much of it. He had nothing to hide. He had just finished running some errands and was on his way home. But as the police car pulled up beside him, the officer inside rolled down the window and called out to him. "Hey, you! Stop right there," the officer said, his voice firm but not aggressive. The man stopped walking and turned to face the officer. He wasn't sure why he was being stopped, but he remained calm. He had been through much tougher situations in his life, and he knew that staying composed was the best way to handle things. "Is there a problem, officer?" the man asked, his voice steady. The officer stepped out of the car, his hand resting on his belt near his holster. He was a middle-aged man with a stern expression, and he looked the veteran up and down as if trying to figure something out. "We've had some reports of suspicious activity in the area," the officer said. "I need to ask you a few questions." The man nodded. He understood that the officer was just doing his job, and he had no reason to be uncooperative. He answered the officer's questions honestly, explaining that he was just walking home after running some errands. But as the conversation continued, the officer's tone began to change. He started asking more pointed questions, and his demeanor became more aggressive. "Do you have any identification on you?" the officer asked, his voice now sharper. The man reached into his pocket to pull out his wallet, but as he did, the officer suddenly stepped forward and grabbed his arm. "Keep your hands where I can see them," the officer barked, his voice loud and commanding. The man was taken aback. He hadn't done anything wrong, and he wasn't sure why the officer was reacting this way. But he didn't resist. He knew that arguing with the officer would only make things worse. He slowly raised his hands, showing that he wasn't a threat. "I was just getting my ID," the man said calmly, trying to explain. But the officer wasn't listening. He quickly handcuffed the man and began patting him down. The man's heart sank. He had never been in trouble with the law before, and he couldn't understand why this was happening. He had served his country with honor, and now he was being treated like a criminal. As the officer searched him, a small crowd began to gather. People from the nearby houses had heard the commotion and came out to see what was going on. They watched in silence as the officer continued to search the man, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern. "What's going on?" one of the bystanders asked, her voice filled with worry. The officer didn't respond. He was too focused on the man in front of him. After a few moments, he stepped back and looked at the man with a cold expression. "You're under arrest," the officer said, his voice firm. The man's eyes widened in shock. "Under arrest? For what?" he asked, his voice rising slightly. "For resisting arrest and obstructing justice," the officer replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. The man couldn't believe what he was hearing. He hadn't resisted arrest, and he certainly hadn't obstructed justice. He had done everything the officer had asked, and yet he was being arrested. He wanted to protest, to explain that there had been a misunderstanding, but he knew it wouldn't do any good. The officer had already made up his mind. As the officer led him to the police car, the man's mind raced. He thought about his family, his friends, and the life he had built after leaving the military. He had always tried to do the right thing, to live with integrity and honor. And now, in a matter of minutes, everything had been turned upside down. The officer opened the back door of the police car and guided the man inside. As the door closed, the man looked out at the small crowd that had gathered. Their faces were filled with confusion and concern, but no one stepped forward to help him. He was alone. The police car drove off, leaving the quiet street behind. The man sat in the back seat, his hands still cuffed, and stared out the window. He didn't know what was going to happen next, but he knew one thing for sure: this wasn't over. He had fought for his country, and he wasn't going to let this injustice stand. As the car drove through the town, the man's thoughts turned to the Pentagon. He had friends there, people he had served with who knew the kind of man he was. If anyone could help him, it was them. But for now, all he could do was wait and see how this situation would unfold. The police car pulled into the station, and the man was led inside. He was processed like any other suspect, his fingerprints taken, and his personal belongings confiscated. He was then placed in a holding cell, where he sat alone, his mind racing with thoughts of what had just happened. As the hours passed, the man's resolve only grew stronger. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, and he was determined to prove it. He had faced much tougher challenges in his life, and he wasn't going to let this one break him. He would fight for his freedom, and he would do it with the same courage and determination that had carried him through his years in the military. Little did he know, his story was about to take a dramatic turn, one that would bring the Pentagon into the fray and change everything. But for now, he could only wait and hope that justice would prevail. The holding cell was small, with cold concrete walls and a single metal bench bolted to the floor. The man sat on the bench, his hands resting on his knees, staring at the floor. The cell was quiet, except for the occasional sound of footsteps echoing down the hallway outside. He had been sitting there for what felt like hours, though he couldn't be sure. Time seemed to move differently in a place like this. His mind was still racing, trying to make sense of what had happened. He had been walking home, minding his own business, and now he was locked up like a criminal. It didn't make any sense. He had always respected the law, always tried to do the right thing. He had served his country, risked his life, and now this? It felt like a betrayal. He thought about his family. His wife would be worried by now. He had told her he'd be home by dinner, and he never broke his promises. He wondered if she had called the police station yet, or if she was still waiting, hoping he'd walk through the door any minute. The thought of her sitting there, wondering where he was, made his chest tighten. He hated the idea of causing her pain. The sound of footsteps grew louder, pulling him out of his thoughts. A police officer appeared at the cell door, holding a clipboard. The officer didn't look at him directly, just flipped through the papers on the clipboard and spoke in a monotone voice. "You've been charged with resisting arrest and obstruction of justice," the officer said, as if reading from a script. "You'll be held here until your arraignment tomorrow morning." The man looked up, his eyes narrowing. "I didn't resist arrest," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I cooperated with the officer. There's been a mistake." The officer shrugged, clearly uninterested. "You can tell that to the judge," he said, before walking away. The man sighed, leaning back against the cold wall. He knew arguing with the officer wouldn't do any good. He needed to stay focused, to think clearly about what to do next. He had been in tough situations before, life in the military had taught him how to stay calm under pressure. But this was different. This wasn't a battlefield, this was his own country, his own town. And yet, he felt just as helpless as he had in some of the most dangerous moments of his life. As the hours dragged on, he began to think about his options. He knew he had the right to a lawyer, but he didn't have one on speed dial. He thought about calling his wife, but he wasn't sure if he'd be allowed to make a phone call yet. He also thought about his friends in the military. Some of them had gone on to work in high-ranking positions, and he wondered if they could help. But he didn't want to drag anyone into this unless he had to. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, another officer appeared at the cell door. This one was younger, with a slightly more sympathetic expression. "You're allowed one phone call," the officer said, unlocking the cell door. "Follow me." The man stood up, his legs stiff from sitting for so long, and followed the officer down the hallway to a small room with a payphone on the wall. The officer handed him the receiver and stepped back, giving him a little privacy. The man hesitated for a moment, then dialed his wife's number. She answered on the second ring, her voice filled with worry. "Where are you?" she asked immediately. "I've been waiting for hours." "I'm at the police station," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "There's been a misunderstanding. I was arrested, but I didn't do anything wrong." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Arrested? What happened?" He explained the situation as quickly as he could, leaving out the details he knew would only upset her more. "I need you to stay calm," he said. "I'm going to figure this out. But I might need your help." "Of course," she said without hesitation. "What can I do?" "Call my friend from the Pentagon," he said. "The one who works in legal affairs. Tell him what's going on and ask if he can help." "I'll call him right away," she said. "Just hang in there, okay? We'll get through this." Her voice was a small comfort, but it was enough to give him a little hope. He thanked her and hung up the phone, feeling a little more in control of the situation. As he was led back to the holding cell, he couldn't help but think about how quickly things had spiraled out of control. 1 minute, he was a respected veteran, a husband, a neighbor. The next, he was just another face in the system, another number on a police report. It was a humbling reminder of how fragile freedom could be. Back in the cell, he sat down on the bench and closed his eyes. He knew the next few hours would be long and difficult, but he also knew he wasn't alone. His wife was fighting for him, and soon, his friends in the military would be too. He just had to hold on a little longer. As the night wore on, the sounds of the police station faded into the background. The man's thoughts turned to the future. He didn't know what would happen next, but he was determined to clear his name. He had faced challenges before, and he had always come out stronger on the other side. This time would be no different. Little did he know, the wheels of justice were already turning. His wife had made the call, and soon, the Pentagon would step in. But for now, all he could do was wait. The next morning, the man's wife woke up early, her mind still racing from the phone call the night before. She had barely slept, tossing and turning as she worried about her husband. But she knew she couldn't just sit around and wait. She had to do something. She quickly got dressed and made her way to the kitchen, where she found the business card her husband had given her years ago. It was for his friend who worked in legal affairs at the Pentagon. She had never thought she'd need to use it, but now, it felt like her only hope. She picked up the phone and dialed the number, her hands trembling slightly. After a few rings, a man's voice answered. "This is Major Daniels," the voice said, crisp and professional. "Hi, this is," wife's name, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm the wife of," husband's name. "He gave me your number a while ago and said to call if we ever needed help." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "Of course," Major Daniels said, his tone softening. "What's going on?" She explained the situation as clearly as she could, her voice breaking a few times as she described how her husband had been arrested for no reason. Major Daniels listened quietly, not interrupting. When she finished, there was a long silence. Then Major Daniels spoke, his voice firm. "This is unacceptable," he said. "Your husband is a decorated veteran. He deserves better than this. I'll make some calls and see what I can do." Relief washed over her. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you so much." "Don't thank me yet," Major Daniels said. "But I'll do everything in my power to help." Just hang in there, okay? She nodded, even though he couldn't see her. Okay. After hanging up the phone, she sat down at the kitchen table, feeling a little lighter. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew her husband had friends in high places who wouldn't let this slide. For the first time since the arrest, she allowed herself to feel a glimmer of hope. Meanwhile, at the Pentagon, Major Daniels wasted no time. He had known the man for years. They had served together in some of the most challenging missions overseas. He knew the kind of person the man was: disciplined, honorable, and deeply committed to doing the right thing. The idea that he had been arrested for something as trivial as resisting arrest didn't sit right with him. Major Daniels picked up his office phone and dialed a number. Within minutes, he was connected to a high-ranking official in the Department of Defense. He explained the situation, emphasizing the man's service record and the injustice of the arrest. "This is a decorated veteran we're talking about," Major Daniels said, his voice firm. "He's not someone who would resist arrest or cause trouble. There's clearly been a mistake, and we need to intervene before this goes any further." The official on the other end of the line listened carefully. "I understand," he said. "Let me make a few calls and see what we can do. This kind of thing shouldn't happen to someone who's served our country." Major Daniels thanked him and hung up the phone. He knew the wheels of bureaucracy could move slowly, but he also knew that when the Pentagon got involved, things tended to happen quickly. He just hoped it would be fast enough to help his friend. Back at the police station, the man was still sitting in the holding cell. He had been there all night, and the exhaustion was starting to set in. His back ached from the hard bench, and his mind was foggy from lack of sleep. But he refused to let himself give in to despair. He had been through worse, and he knew he could get through this. Around mid-morning, a different officer appeared at the cell door. This one looked younger and less hardened than the others. He unlocked the door and gestured for the man to follow him. "You've got a visitor," the officer said. The man stood up, his legs stiff from sitting for so long, and followed the officer down the hallway to a small visitation room. When he walked in, he saw his wife sitting at a table, her face pale but determined. "Are you okay?" she asked as soon as he sat down. "I'm fine," he said, giving her a reassuring smile. "Just tired." "What's going on out there?" She quickly filled him in on the call she had made to Major Daniels and the steps that were being taken to help him. "They're going to get you out of here," she said, her voice filled with hope. The man nodded, feeling a surge of gratitude. "Thank you," he said. "I knew I could count on you." They talked for a few more minutes, but the visit was cut short when the officer returned to escort the man back to his cell. As he walked down the hallway, he felt a little more hopeful. He knew the Pentagon didn't get involved in local matters lightly, and the fact that they were stepping in meant that things were about to change. By the afternoon, the police station was buzzing with activity. The officers had received a call from the Department of Defense, and it was clear that something big was happening. The man could hear the murmurs of conversation outside his cell, but he couldn't make out what was being said. Finally, the door to his cell opened, and the same officer who had arrested him the night before walked in. This time, the officer's demeanor was completely different. He looked nervous, almost apologetic. "You're being released," the officer said, avoiding eye contact. The man raised an eyebrow. "Just like that?" The officer nodded. "There's been a misunderstanding. The charges have been dropped." The man didn't say anything. He just stood up and followed the officer out of the cell. As he walked down the hallway, he could feel the eyes of the other officers on him. They were watching him with a mix of curiosity and unease, as if they knew something had shifted but weren't sure what. When he reached the front desk, he was handed his personal belongings and a piece of paper stating that the charges had been dismissed. He signed the paperwork without a word, then walked out of the police station and into the sunlight. His wife was waiting for him outside, her face breaking into a relieved smile as soon as she saw him. She ran over and hugged him tightly, tears streaming down her face. "It's over," she said. "You're free." The man held her close, feeling a wave of emotions he couldn't quite put into words. He was relieved, angry, grateful, and exhausted all at once. But more than anything, he was determined. This wasn't just about him, it was about making sure something like this didn't happen to anyone else. As they walked to the car, he looked up at the sky and took a deep breath. The fight wasn't over yet, but he knew he wasn't alone. The Pentagon had his back, and so did the people who loved him. And that was enough to keep him going. The ride home from the police station was quiet. The man sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window as his wife drove. The streets of their small town looked the same as they always had, quiet, peaceful, and familiar. But everything felt different now. The arrest had shaken him in a way he hadn't expected. It wasn't just the humiliation of being handcuffed and locked up, it was the realization that everything he had worked for, everything he had believed in, could be taken away in an instant. His wife glanced at him from the driver's seat, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. He nodded, though he wasn't sure if it was true. "I'll be fine," he said. "Just need some time to process everything." She reached over and squeezed his hand. "We'll get through this," she said. Together. When they got home, the man took a long shower, trying to wash away the feeling of the holding cell. He changed into clean clothes and sat down at the kitchen table, where his wife had made him a cup of tea. She sat across from him, watching him with worried eyes. "What happens now?" she asked. He took a sip of the tea, letting the warmth soothe him. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I'm not going to let this go. What happened to me wasn't right, and I need to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." His wife nodded. "I'll support you no matter what," she said. "But you need to be careful. This could get messy." He knew she was right. Taking on the police wasn't something to be done lightly. But he also knew he couldn't just walk away. He had spent his life fighting for what was right, and this was no different. The next morning, the man received a call from Major Daniels. "I heard you were released," Major Daniels said. "How are you holding up?" "I've been better," the man replied. "But I'm grateful for your help. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in." "You don't have to thank me," Major Daniels said. "But this isn't over. We need to make sure this kind of thing doesn't happen again. I've already started looking into it, and I think we have a case. But it's going to take some work." The man listened as Major Daniels explained the next steps. They would need to gather evidence, file a formal complaint, and possibly even take legal action. It was a lot to take in, but the man was ready. He had faced tougher challenges before, and he wasn't going to back down now. "I'm in," the man said. "Whatever it takes." Over the next few days, the man and his wife worked closely with Major Daniels to build their case. They gathered witness statements from the people who had seen the arrest, reviewed the police report, and even obtained footage from a nearby security camera. The more they dug, the clearer it became that the arrest had been unjustified. The man also reached out to a local civil rights organization, which agreed to take on his case. They assigned him a lawyer, a sharp and determined woman who had spent years fighting for justice in similar situations. "This is a strong case," the lawyer said during their first meeting. "But it's not going to be easy. The police don't like being challenged, and they'll fight back. Are you ready for that?" The man nodded. "I've been through worse," he said. "And I'm not doing this just for me. I'm doing it for everyone who's been treated unfairly." The lawyer smiled. "Good. Then let's get to work." As the case gained momentum, the man started to feel a sense of purpose again. He had spent so much of his life serving his country, and now he was serving his community in a different way. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he also knew it was worth it. One evening, as he and his wife sat on the porch watching the sunset, she turned to him and said, "I'm proud of you, you know." He looked at her, surprised. "Why?" "Because you're not letting this break you," she said. "You're turning something terrible into something good. That's not easy to do." He smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest that had been missing for a long time. "I couldn't do it without you," he said. They sat there in silence for a while, watching the sky turn from orange to purple. The man knew the fight wasn't over, but for the first time since the arrest, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The investigation into the arrest moved quickly. With the help of Major Daniels, the civil rights organization, and the lawyer, the man was able to gather a significant amount of evidence. The security camera footage from a nearby store clearly showed the moment of the arrest. In the video, the man could be seen standing calmly, his hands visible, as the officer approached him. There was no sign of resistance or aggression, just a man who had been going about his day, only to be suddenly handcuffed and taken away. The witness statements also painted a clear picture. Several people who had been on the street that evening came forward to say that the man had done nothing wrong. One woman, who had been walking her dog nearby, said she had seen the entire interaction. "He was just standing there," she told the lawyer during an interview. "He wasn't causing any trouble. The officer seemed to escalate things for no reason. It didn't make sense." The man's lawyer, a sharp and determined woman named Rachel, reviewed all the evidence carefully. She had handled cases like this before, and she knew how hard it could be to hold law enforcement accountable. But she also knew that this case was different. The man's military background, combined with the clear evidence of misconduct, made it a strong case. "We have everything we need to move forward," Rachel said during a meeting with the man and his wife. "But we need to be prepared for pushback. The police department isn't going to take this lying down." The man nodded. He had expected as much. "What's the next step?" he asked. "We file a formal complaint with the police department," Rachel explained. "And we also file a lawsuit. We're going to demand accountability, not just for you, but for anyone else who might have been treated unfairly by this officer." The man's wife, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. "What about the officer who arrested him? What happens to him?" Rachel sighed. "That's harder to predict. If the internal investigation finds that he acted improperly, he could face disciplinary action. But it's also possible that nothing will happen. That's why we're pursuing the lawsuit, to make sure there are consequences." The man leaned forward, his expression serious. "I don't want to ruin anyone's career," he said. "But what happened to me wasn't right. If this officer has done this to other people, it needs to stop." Rachel nodded. "That's exactly what we're fighting for." The formal complaint was filed the next day. It outlined the details of the arrest, including the lack of probable cause and the officer's aggressive behavior. It also included the security footage and witness statements, making it clear that the man had done nothing wrong. The police department initially responded with a statement defending the officer's actions. They claimed that he had been acting on a report of suspicious activity in the area and that the man had failed to comply with his instructions. But as the evidence began to circulate, public opinion started to shift. Local news outlets picked up the story, and soon it was making headlines. "Decorated veteran wrongfully arrested," one headline read. "Police under fire for handling a veteran's arrest," said another. The story spread quickly, sparking outrage in the community and beyond. The man found himself at the center of a growing movement. People he had never met before reached out to him, sharing their own stories of injustice and offering their support. He realized that his case was about more than just him, it was about holding those in power accountable and fighting for a fairer system. One evening, as the man and his wife were sitting at the kitchen table, his phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Major Daniels. "Turn on the news," the message read. The man grabbed the remote and turned on the TV. The local news was running a segment about his case. The anchor was interviewing a community leader who had been following the story closely. "This is a clear example of systemic issues within our police department," the community leader said. "We need transparency and accountability. This veteran served our country, and this is how he's treated. It's unacceptable." The man's wife reached over and squeezed his hand. "People are listening," she said. "This is making a difference." He nodded, feeling a mix of emotions. He was grateful for the support, but he also felt the weight of responsibility. He knew that his case had the potential to bring about real change, but it also meant that he was under a microscope. Every move he made would be scrutinized, and the pressure was intense. The next day, Rachel called with an update. "The police department has agreed to open an internal investigation," she said. "They're also reviewing their policies and procedures. This is a big step." The man felt a surge of hope. "Does this mean they're admitting they were wrong?" "Not exactly," Rachel said. "But it's a sign that they're taking this seriously. We'll keep pushing, but this is progress." The man hung up the phone and turned to his wife. "They're investigating," he said. "This could actually change things." She smiled, but there was a hint of worry in her eyes. "Just be careful," she said. "This isn't over yet." As the investigation continued, the man started to receive more attention. He was invited to speak at community meetings and local events, where he shared his story and called for reform. He wasn't comfortable being in the spotlight, but he knew it was important. At one event, a young man approached him after his speech. "Thank you for speaking out," the young man said. "I've been through something similar, and it means a lot to see someone fighting back." The man shook his hand, feeling a sense of connection. "We're in this together," he said. Meanwhile, the officer who had arrested him was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. The man didn't feel any satisfaction in that. He knew that the officer was just one part of a larger system. But he also knew that accountability was important. As the weeks went by, the man started to feel a sense of purpose again. He had spent so much of his life serving his country, and now he was serving his community in a different way. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he also knew it was worth it. The lawsuit was filed a few weeks later. It named the police department and the officer as defendants, seeking damages for the wrongful arrest and calling for changes to the department's policies and training procedures. The legal team had worked tirelessly to prepare the case, gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, and drafting a compelling argument. The man knew this was a critical step, not just for him, but for anyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of injustice. The lawsuit quickly gained national attention. News outlets from across the country picked up the story, and the man found himself at the center of a national conversation about police accountability and veterans' rights. Reporters reached out for interviews, and he was invited to speak on panels and at community events. It was overwhelming at times, but he knew it was necessary. One evening, as he sat at the kitchen table with his wife, he sighed and rubbed his temples. "I never wanted this kind of attention," he said. "I just wanted to clear my name." His wife reached over and took his hand. "I know," she said softly. "But this is bigger than just you now. People are looking to you for hope. You're giving them a voice." He nodded, though the weight of it all still felt heavy. "I just hope we can make a real difference." The first major development in the lawsuit came when the police department filed a motion to dismiss the case. They argued that the officer had acted within his rights and that the arrest was justified. The man's legal team, led by Rachel, fought back hard. They presented the security footage, witness statements, and expert testimony to show that the arrest had been baseless and that the officer had overstepped his authority. The judge denied the motion to dismiss, allowing the case to move forward. It was a small victory, but it was an important one. The man felt a surge of hope as he realized that the system was starting to work in his favor. As the case progressed, the man continued to speak out. He attended rallies, gave interviews, and met with community leaders to discuss ways to improve police-community relations. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore, he was fighting for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly by the system. One day, he received a call from a young veteran who had seen his story on the news. The young man's voice was shaky as he explained that he had been through something similar. "I didn't know what to do," the young veteran said. "I felt so alone. But seeing you stand up like this, it gives me hope." The man listened quietly, his heart aching for the young veteran. "You're not alone," he said. "We're in this together. If you need help, let me know. We'll get through this." After hanging up the phone, the man sat in silence for a long time. He thought about all the people who had reached out to him, sharing their stories and offering their support. It was humbling to realize how many people had been affected by similar injustices. The next major development in the case came when the police department offered a settlement. They proposed a financial settlement in exchange for dropping the lawsuit. The man's legal team presented the offer to him, but he was hesitant. "If we take the settlement, does that mean they don't have to admit they were wrong?" he asked. Rachel nodded. "That's usually how it works. They'll pay the settlement, but they won't have to make any changes to their policies or admit any wrongdoing." The man shook his head. "That's not good enough. I don't want their money. I want them to admit what they did and make sure it doesn't happen again." Rachel smiled. "I thought you might say that. We'll keep fighting." The case went to trial a few months later. The courtroom was packed with reporters, community members, and supporters. The man sat at the plaintiff's table, his wife by his side, as the trial began. The prosecution presented their case first, arguing that the officer had acted within his rights and that the arrest was justified. They called witnesses, including the officer who had made the arrest, and tried to paint the man as uncooperative and suspicious. But when it was the defense's turn, Rachel and her team dismantled the prosecution's arguments piece by piece. They presented the security footage, which clearly showed the man standing calmly with his hands visible. They called witnesses who testified that the man had done nothing wrong. And they brought in experts who explained how the officer's actions had violated standard police procedures. The most powerful moment came when the man took the stand. He spoke calmly and clearly, describing what had happened that night and how it had affected him. "I served my country for over a decade," he said. "I fought for the values that this country stands for: freedom, justice, and equality. What happened to me that night was a betrayal of those values. I'm not here for money or revenge. I'm here because I want to make sure that no one else has to go through what I did." The courtroom was silent as he spoke. Even the judge seemed moved by his words. When the trial ended, the jury deliberated for several days. The man tried to stay calm, but the waiting was agonizing. He spent the time with his wife, talking about their future and what they would do once the trial was over. Finally, the jury reached a verdict. The courtroom was packed as the judge read the decision. "We find in favor of the plaintiff," the judge said. The man felt a wave of relief wash over him. He turned to his wife, who was crying tears of joy, and hugged her tightly. The jury awarded him a significant settlement, but more importantly, they ruled that the police department had to make changes to their policies and training procedures. It was a victory not just for the man, but for the entire community. The victory in court was just the beginning. The man knew that real change would take time, but he was determined to keep fighting. The settlement and the court's ruling had set a precedent, but he understood that the work didn't end there. He wanted to ensure that the changes mandated by the court were implemented effectively and that the police department took meaningful steps to address the systemic issues that had led to his wrongful arrest. In the weeks following the trial, the man worked closely with community leaders, civil rights organizations, and his legal team to monitor the police department's progress. The court had ordered the department to revise its training procedures, particularly around de-escalation techniques and interactions with veterans and marginalized communities. The man made it his mission to hold them accountable every step of the way. One of the first changes was the introduction of mandatory training sessions for all officers. The man was invited to speak at one of these sessions, sharing his story and explaining how the arrest had impacted him. Standing in front of a room full of officers, he felt a mix of emotions, nervousness, anger, but also hope. "I'm not here to blame anyone," he began, his voice steady. "I'm here because I believe in accountability and growth. What happened to me wasn't just a mistake, it was a failure of the system. But it's a failure we can fix. We can do better. And we have to." The room was silent as he spoke. Some officers looked uncomfortable, while others nodded in agreement. When he finished, a few officers approached him to shake his hand and thank him for sharing his story. It was a small but meaningful step toward building trust and understanding. The man also worked with local veterans organizations to create a program that would help law enforcement better understand the unique challenges faced by veterans. Many veterans struggled with PTSD, anxiety, and other issues that could make interactions with police more complicated. The program provided training on how to recognize these challenges and respond with empathy and respect. "This isn't just about preventing wrongful arrests," the man explained during a meeting with the program's organizers. "It's about making sure that veterans feel supported and understood. They've already given so much for this country. They shouldn't have to fight for respect when they come home." The program was well received, and it quickly expanded to other communities. The man felt a sense of pride as he saw the impact it was having. He knew it was just one piece of the puzzle, but it was a step in the right direction. As the man continued his advocacy work, he also took time to focus on his own healing. The arrest and the trial had taken a toll on him, both emotionally and mentally. He started seeing a therapist who specialized in trauma, and he found it helpful to talk through his feelings in a safe and supportive environment. His wife was his rock throughout it all. She had stood by him every step of the way, offering unwavering support and encouragement. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, she turned to him and said, "I'm so proud of you. You've turned something terrible into something good." He smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest that had been missing for a long time. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said. "You've been my strength through all of this." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "We're a team," she said. "Always have been, always will be." The man's story continued to inspire others. He received letters and messages from people all over the country, thanking him for his courage and sharing their own stories of injustice. One letter, in particular, stood out to him. It was from a young woman whose brother had been wrongfully arrested a few years earlier. "Your story gave me hope," she wrote. "My brother didn't have the resources to fight back, and it destroyed him. But seeing you stand up and demand accountability, it makes me believe that things can change. Thank you for giving us hope." The man read the letter several times, his heart aching for the young woman and her brother. He realized that his fight wasn't just about him, it was about all the people who had been silenced or ignored. It was about creating a system where everyone, regardless of their background, could expect fairness and justice. The man's advocacy work also caught the attention of lawmakers. He was invited to testify before a state legislative committee that was considering reforms to police training and accountability measures. It was a daunting opportunity, but he knew it was important. On the day of the hearing, the man stood at the podium, looking out at the committee members and the packed room of spectators. He took a deep breath and began to speak. "I stand before you not just as a veteran, but as a citizen who believes in the values this country was founded on, justice, equality, and accountability," he said. "What happened to me was a failure of those values. But it was also an opportunity to learn, to grow, and to do better." I urge you to support these reforms, not just for me, but for everyone who deserves to be treated with dignity and respect." His testimony was met with applause, and several committee members thanked him for his courage and insight. The reforms were eventually passed, and the man felt a sense of accomplishment knowing that his voice had helped bring about real change. The man's journey had been long and difficult, but it had also been transformative. He had started as a quiet, unassuming veteran who had been wronged by the system. But through his courage and determination, he had become a leader, an advocate, and a symbol of hope. His story had inspired countless others to speak out against injustice, and his efforts had brought about real, tangible change in his community and beyond. As he looked to the future, he knew that his work was far from over. But he also knew that he wasn't alone. He had his wife, his community, and countless supporters who believed in his cause. Together, they would continue to fight for justice and accountability. One of the most significant outcomes of the lawsuit was the creation of a community oversight board for the police department. The board, made up of local residents, civil rights advocates, and legal experts, was tasked with reviewing complaints against officers and ensuring that the department's policies were being followed. The man was invited to serve on the board, and he accepted without hesitation. At the first meeting, he sat at the table with the other members, feeling a mix of pride and responsibility. He knew that this was an opportunity to make a lasting impact, and he was determined to use his position to advocate for fairness and transparency. "This board is about more than just holding people accountable," he said during the meeting. "It's about building trust between the police and the community. It's about making sure that everyone feels safe and respected." The other members nodded in agreement, and the man felt a sense of camaraderie. They were all there for the same reason, to make their community a better place. The man's advocacy work also extended beyond his local community. He was invited to speak at national conferences and events, where he shared his story and called for systemic reform. His message resonated with people from all walks of life, and he became a respected voice in the fight for justice. At one conference, he was approached by a young activist who had been inspired by his story. "Your courage gave me the strength to keep going," the young man said. "I was ready to give up, but seeing what you've accomplished, it made me believe that change is possible." The man smiled, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. "Change is always possible," he said. "But it takes all of us working together. Keep fighting. Your voice matters." Despite the progress, the man knew that there were still many challenges to address. The fight for justice was ongoing, and there would always be setbacks and obstacles. But he was determined to keep pushing forward. One evening, as he sat on the porch with his wife, watching the sunset, she turned to him and said, "You've done so much already. Are you ready for what's next?" He smiled, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. "I'm ready," he said. "This is just the beginning." The man's story had come full circle. What had started as a personal injustice had grown into a movement for change. He had turned his pain into purpose, and his fight had inspired others to do the same. As he looked out at the horizon, he thought about all the people who had supported him along the way, his wife, his friends, his legal team, and the countless strangers who had reached out to share their stories. He knew that he couldn't have done it without them. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice filled with emotion. His wife looked at him, confused. "For what?" "For everything," he said. "For believing in me. For standing by me. For helping me turn this into something good." She smiled and took his hand. "We're a team," she said. "Always have been, always will be."